Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our consultant hats and really break down a classic business case. So let's dive right in and solve finding fulfillment. So picture this. Our client is a really successful online toy store. They ship toys all across the country from one single warehouse. But like a lot of e-commerce companies, they've hit a wall, a really critical decision point. And it's all about logistics. And that leads us to the big question on the table. Should they keep doing everything themselves? Or should they hand over their entire distribution operation to a specialist? We're going to tackle this exactly like a top-tier consultant would. So, to get to a really smart, data-driven answer, we'll follow this 5-part agenda. We'll kick things off by really understanding the problem, then we'll structure our approach. After that, we'll dive into the strategic side of things, then crunch the numbers, and finally pull it all together for the big recommendation. Okay, first things first, let's really dig into the client's core problem. And for this company, it pretty much boils down to a single word: seasonality. I mean, think about it. It's a toy store, so a staggering 80% of all their sales happen in just 2 months, November and December. For the other 10 months of the year, their huge, expensive warehouse is basically just sitting there, 3/4 empty. That is a massive drain on their resources. Now, a great consultant never just jumps into the data. You've got to build a framework first. We're going to use a principle called MEAS. It's a fancy acronym that just means we'll cover all our bases without getting repetitive. It's the key to a really bulletproof analysis. So our structure is going to be a classic 2-pronged attack. First, we'll look at all the qualitative stuff. The strategic pros and cons, the things that don't neatly fit into a spreadsheet. Then, and only then, are we going to dive into the quantitative part and crunch the hard numbers. So let's kick things off with that qualitative piece. What are those big picture strategic questions that we need to think about before we even look at a single dollar sign? And lucky for us, the original case material lays out these core trade-offs perfectly. On one hand, you have the benefits of outsourcing, things like simplicity and focus. But on the other hand, you've got the downsides, like losing control. Let's unpack that a little. Okay, so on the pro side, outsourcing would let them focus on what they're actually good at, selling toys. And it would completely get rid of that annual nightmare of hiring tons of holiday staff. But the cons here are pretty serious. They'd lose control over their packaging and branding, they'd be betting the farm on a vendor not failing during their busiest season, and they'd give up some profit. It really comes down to a classic trade-off. Do you want operational ease, or do you want strategic control? All right, we've thought through the strategy. Now it's time to get our hands dirty with the numbers. Let's build out the costs for each scenario, piece by piece, and see which one is actually cheaper on paper. To do a fair comparison, we have to start with a baseline. So let's figure out exactly what the toy store is spending to run its own fulfillment operation right now. Okay, first up is labor. They have 4 full-time people, which costs them $200,000 a year. But then, for the holidays, they have to bring in 30. That's right, 30 temporary workers. That adds another $96,000. So all in, their total labor cost is $296,000. Next, you gotta add the costs for the physical building. Rent, utilities, and equipment run about $75,000, plus another $9,000 for insurance. That's a total of $84,000 in fixed costs for the warehouse itself. Now here's a really interesting detail, and it's one that a lot of people might miss. The company actually charges a $1 handling fee on every single package. And since they ship 130,000 packages a year, that's not a cost. That's $130,000 of income that helps offset their expenses. So let's put it all together. You take the labor cost, $296,000, add the warehouse cost, $84,000, and then you subtract that handling fee income of $130,000. And that gives us our final baseline number. The total net cost to do everything in-house is $250,000 a year. Okay, we've got our baseline. Now let's run the numbers on the other option. What if they hand everything over to a third-party company called Danny's Fulfillment? We'll build up their costs just like we did before. Danny's pricing has 3 main parts. First, storage, which costs more during the peak season and comes out to $135,000 for the year. Second, they charge that same dollar per package handling fee, so that's another $130,000. And finally, there are some small restocking fees for returns, which add about $7,800. So you add all of Danny's fees together, and you get the grand total for the outsourced option, a projected cost of $272,800. So let's put those 2 final numbers right next to each other. Keeping it in-house costs $250,000. Outsourcing costs almost $273,000. On a purely financial basis, staying in-house is cheaper by about $23,000 a year. The numbers have spoken. Keeping it in-house saves money. So that's it, case closed, right? Well, this is the exact point where a decent analyst stops, but a great consultant knows the real work is just beginning. Because the numbers, well, they don't always tell you the whole story. And that brings us to the final and, honestly, the most important step, synthesis. This is where we take the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis and we blend them together to give real strategic advice that goes way beyond just the bottom line.
So here's the key insight. That $23,000 savings, it's less than 1% of the company's total revenue. Is that tiny saving really worth the enormous operational headache of managing all of this? We don't think so. Outsourcing frees up the entire management team to focus on what they do best, marketing and selling toys. Yeah, losing some brand control is a risk, but it's a risk you can manage. So, our final recommendation is to outsource. That small extra cost isn't really a cost, it's an investment in focus and strategic flexibility.
This case is a perfect example of why you can't just look at a spreadsheet. It teaches us that, yeah, the numbers are critical, but they're almost never the whole story. The best decisions happen when you weigh that hard data against the bigger strategic picture. So I guess the question I'll leave you with is this. In your next big decision, are you looking at just the numbers, or are you seeing the whole story?